This presentation was inspired by Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress. In the 11th chapter, Teaching New Worlds, New Words, Hooks explains how enslaved Africans learned English as an act of resistance. They were from different tribes and spoke different languages. The enslaved were not able to communicate with one another, so, in an act of defiance, they learned English. Hooks has a powerful quote. She writes, "This is the oppressor's languages, yet I needed to talk to you." Let that sink in. Black English in the Americas was born out of resistance. This presentation will serve as a timeline of Black voices' continued resistance, walking you through Black English from the beginning of enslavement to today. Once the enslaved learned their own dialects of English, they relied on oral tradition. It was illegal for the enslaved to learn to read and write. If found trying to read or write, they could be hanged. They had to verbally communicate everything. The enslaved learned to pass messages of resistance through spirituals and folk songs. Many times they were whipped and beaten in public displays to discourage others from attempting to read or write. Some of the early texts the enslaved were allowed to read was the Holy Bible. The Bible was used as a tool to manipulate slaves with scripture. Nat Turner's Rebellion, historically known as the Southampton Insurrection, was a rebellion of enslaved Virginians that took place in Southampton County, Virginia, in August 1831. Led by Nat Turner, the rebels killed between 55 and 65 white people, making it the deadliest slave revolt in U.S. history. Nat was a Christian that believed that God wanted it to revolt. Soon, slave narratives started to appear, of course out of resistance. One of the first slave narratives was from Alauda Equiano, the interesting narrative of the life of Alauda Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, in 1789. In his narrative, he exposed the transatlantic slave as an act of resistance. Equiano recounted how his early life in Africa was interrupted when he was kidnapped by slave traders. He was separated from his family, writing, "We were soon deprived of even the smallest comfort of weeping together." Equiano was bought and sold, marched to the African coast, and shipped in squalid conditions to America. The next narrative is from Linda Brent, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself as an autobiography by Harriet Jacobs, a mother and fugitive slave, published in 1861 by L. Maria Child, who edited the book for its author. Jacobs used the pseudonym Linda Brent. The book documents Jacobs's life as a slave and how she gained freedom for herself and for her children. Jacobs contributed to the genre of slave narrative by using the techniques of sentimental novels to address race and gender issues. The next voice of resistance is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping from slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts and New York, becoming famous for his oratory and incisive anti-slavery writings. Accordingly, he was described by abolitionists in his time as a living counterexample to enslavers' arguments that enslaved people lacked the intellectual capacity to function as independent American citizens. African Americans were starting to express themselves through poetry. Paul Laurence Dunbar was an American poet, novelist, and short story writer of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Born in Dayton, Ohio, to parents who had been enslaved in Kentucky before the American Civil War, Dunbar began writing stories and verse when he was a child. He published his first poems at the age of 16 in a Dayton newspaper and served as president of his high school's literary society. Much of Dunbar's more popular work in his lifetime was written in the Negro dialect associated with the antebellum South, though he also used the Midwestern regional dialect of James Whitcomb Riley. Dunbar also wrote in conventional English and other poetry and novels and is considered the first important African-American sonnet writer. Civil War and Reconstruction. The short-lived era of Reconstruction in the United States elicited an unprecedented optimism from African-American writers. Elizabeth Keckley, who rose from slavery in St. Louis to become the modiste and confidante of First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary articulated in her autobiography, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, a spirit of sectional reconciliation espoused by many other leading African Americans of the Reconstruction era. When you think about influential Black intellectuals in history, Booker T. Washington and Webb Dubois are among the first names that come to mind. Both men are pioneers in their own right as they paved the way for the civil rights movement, but their differing ideologies were arguably more controversial than Martin versus Malcolm. Their opposing philosophies can be found in much of today's discussions over how to end class and racial injustice, what is the role of Black leadership, and what do the haves owe the have-nots in the Black community. The next voice of resistance is of James Weldon Johnson. James Weldon Johnson was an American writer and civil rights activist. He was married to civil rights activist Grace Nail Johnson. Johnson was a leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, where he started working in 1917. In 1920, he was chosen as executive secretary of the organization, effectively the operating officer. One of Johnson's most notable works, God's Trombones, 7 Negro Sermons and Verses, a 1927 book of poems by James Weldon Johnson patterned after traditional African-American religious oratory. African-American scholars Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West have identified the collection as one of Johnson's 2 most notable works, the other being Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. The Harlem Renaissance was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a black cultural mecca in the early 20th century and the subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. Lasting roughly from the 1910 seconds through the mid-1930s, the period is considered a golden age in African-American culture, manifesting in literature, music, stage performance, and art. During the Renaissance, prominent figures such as Marcus Garvey. Harlem's famed streets are rich with stories, many named to honor titans of black history and civil rights. Frederick Douglass Boulevard, Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, Malcolm X Boulevard. Among those streets sits Marcus Garvey Park, a 20-acre tribute to the Jamaican-born activist and his complicated legacy. Marcus Garvey may be less familiar to some, but his ideas are all around us. King once described Garvey as the first man on a mass scale and level to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity and destiny. Back in the early 1920s, when Garvey was living in Harlem, the idea of black nationalism, of unapologetic black pride, was something whispered, not shouted. It was the Jim Crow era, after all, when white supremacy was the law and notions of white superiority were peddled by scientists in the U.S. and Europe. The origins of the Harlem Renaissance lie in the Great Migration of the early 20th century. Hundreds of thousands of black people migrated from the South into dense urban areas that offered relatively more economic opportunities and cultural capital. Poetry from the Harlem Renaissance reflected a diversity of forms and subjects. Despite the enormous outpouring of creativity during the 1920s, the vogue of black writing, black art, and black culture waned markedly in the early 1930s as the Great Depression took hold in the United States. African-American pundits in the 1930s and 40s tended to depreciate the achievements of the new Negroes, calling instead for a more politically engaged, socially critical realism in literature. James Baldwin, in full James Arthur Baldwin, American essayist, novelist, and playwright whose eloquence and passion on the subject of race in America made him an important voice, particularly in the late 1950s and early 1960s in the United States and, later, through much of Western Europe. Baldwin was an outspoken critic of the United States' treatment of black Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. He was an American Baptist minister and activist who was one of the most prominent leaders in the American civil rights movement from 1955 until his assassination on April 4, 1968. A black church leader and the son of early civil rights activist and minister Martin Luther King Sr. King advanced civil rights for people of color in the United States through nonviolence and civil disobedience. Inspired by his Christian beliefs and the nonviolent activism of Mahatma Gandhi, he led targeted, nonviolent resistance against Jim Crow laws and other forms of discrimination in the United States. Malcolm X was an American Muslim minister and human rights activist who was a prominent figure during the civil rights movement. A spokesman for the Nation of Islam until 1964, he was a vocal advocate for black empowerment and the promotion of Islam within the black community. A posthumous autobiography, on which he collaborated with Alex Haley, was published in 1965. Huey Percy Newton was an African-American revolutionary and political activist. Newton was most notable for being a co-founder of the Black Panther Party, where he operated the organization as the de facto leader. Newton crafted the party's 10-point manifesto with Bobby Seale in 1966. Under Newton's leadership, the Black Panther Party founded over 60 community support programs, renamed survival programs in 1971, including food banks, medical clinics, sickle cell anemia tests, prison busing for families of inmates, legal advice seminars, clothing banks, housing cooperatives, and their own ambulance service. The most famous of these programs was the Free Breakfast for Children program, which fed thousands of impoverished children daily during the early 1970s. Robert George Seale is an American engineer, political activist, and author. Seale is widely known for co-founding the Black Panther Party with fellow activist Huey P. Newton. Founded as the Black Panther Party for self-defense, the party's main practice was monitoring police activity activities and challenging police brutality in black communities, first in Oakland, California, and later in cities throughout the United States. Another voice or resistance is Assata Olugbala Shakur, born Joe and Deborah Byron, July 16, 1947, an American political activist who was a member of the Black Liberation Army. In 1977, she was convicted in the first-degree murder of State Trooper Werner Forster during a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973. She escaped from prison in 1979 and is currently wanted by the FBI with a $1 million reward for her apprehension. Maya Angelou, born Marguerite Annie Johnson, April 4, 1928, May 28, 2014, was an American memoirist, poet, and civil rights activist. She published 7 autobiographies, 3 books of essays, several books of poetry, and is credited with a list of plays, movies, and television shows spanning over 50 years. She received dozens of awards and more than 50 honorary degrees. Angelou is best known for her series of 7 autobiographies, which focus on her childhood and early adult experiences. The first, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, tells of her life up to the age of 17 and brought her international recognition and acclaim. Toni Morrison was an American novelist. Her first novel, The Bluest Eye, was published in 1970. The critically acclaimed Song of Solomon brought her national attention and won the National Book Critics Circle Award. In 1988, Morrison won the Pulitzer Prize for Beloved. She was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. A hip-hop group, NWA, made headlines with a song titled Fuck the Police. NWA was an American hip-hop group formed in Compton, California. They were among the earliest and most significant popularizers and controversial figures of the gangster rap subgenre, and the group is widely considered one of the greatest and most influential groups in the history of hip-hop music. Public Enemy is an American hip-hop group formed by Chuck D and Flavor Flav on Long Island, New York, in 1985. The group rose to prominence for their political messages, including subjects such as American racism and the American media. Their debut album, Yo, Bum Rush the Show, was released in 1987 to critical acclaim, and their second album, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, was the first hip-hop album to top the Village Voices Pass and Job Critics poll. The Million Man March was a large gathering of African-American men in Washington, D.C., on October 16, 1995. Called by Louis Farrakhan, it was held on and around the National Mall. The National African American Leadership Summit, a leading group of civil rights activists, and the Nation of Islam, working with scores of civil rights organizations, including many local chapters of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, formed the Million Man March Organizing Committee. The founder of the National African American Leadership Summit, Benjamin Chavis Jr., served as National Director of the Million Man March. Cornel Ronald West is an American philosopher, political activist, social critic, actor, and public intellectual. The grandson of a Baptist minister, West focuses on the role of race, gender, and class in American society, the means by which people act and react to their radical conditionedness. A socialist, West draws intellectual contributions from multiple traditions, including Christianity, the Black Church, Marxism, Neopragmatism, and Transcendentalism. Among his most influential books are Race Matters and Democracy Matters. Tupac Amaru Shakur, born Lesane Parish Crooks, June 16, 1971, September 13, 1996, also known by his stage name Tupac and briefly McAvely, was an American rapper. He is widely considered one of the most influential and successful rappers of all time. Shakur is among the best-selling music artists, having sold more than 75 million records worldwide. Much of Shakur's music has been noted for addressing contemporary social issues that plagued inner cities, and he is considered a symbol of activism against inequality. The Gina Six were 6 black teenagers in Gina, Louisiana, convicted in the 2006 beating of Justin Barker, a white student at the local Gina High School, which they also attended. Barker was injured on December 4, 2006, by the members of the Gina Six and received treatment at an emergency room. While the case was pending, it was often cited by some media commentators as an example of racial injustice in the United States. Some commentators believed that the defendants had been charged initially with 2 serious offenses and had been treated unfairly. The Ferguson unrest, sometimes called the Ferguson Uprising, Ferguson Protest, or the Ferguson Riots. They were a series of protests and riots which began in Ferguson, Missouri, Missouri on August 10, 2014, the day after the fatal shooting of Michael Brown by FPD officer Darren Wilson. The unrest sparked a vigorous debate in the United States about the relationship between law enforcement officers and African Americans, the militarization of police, and the use of force law in Missouri and nationwide. Continuing activism expanded the issues by including modern-day debtors' prisons. Black Lives Matter is a decentralized political and social movement that seeks to highlight racism, discrimination, and racial inequality experienced by black people. Its primary concerns are incidents of police brutality and racially motivated violence against black people. Colin Rand Kaepernick, born November 3, 1987, is an American civil rights activist and football quarterback who is a free agent. He played 6 seasons for the San Francisco 49ers in the National Football League. In 2016, he knelt during the national anthem at the start of NFL games in protest of police brutality and racial inequality in the United States. George Perry Floyd Jr. was an African-American man who was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was during an arrest made after a store clerk suspected Floyd may have used a counterfeit $20 bill. On May 25, 2020, Derek Chauvin, one of the 4 police officers who arrived on the scene, knelt on Floyd's neck and back for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. This caused a lack of oxygen. After his murder, protests against police brutality, especially towards black people, quickly spread across the United States and globally. His dying words, "I can't breathe," became a rallying slogan. All in all, black voices have a history steeped in resistance. There are thousands of voices I did not cover, but I hope this gave you a snapshot throughout American history.